Hello, just a quick video today. It is a gray Wednesday evening, and um, something I want to get off my chest. Before we get into it, I'll just plug my Patreon. Um, if you like what I do and you want more of this type of video, let me know. And you can support me for as little as $1 a month on patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Um, But yeah, so I'll just go ahead and get into it. Um, I am not going to be specific about what I'm responding to because it could apply to so many things. But one thing in particular that comes to mind is like just the way people talk about movies on Letterboxd is borderline insufferable to me at this point. Um, and I guess I'll just get into it. Art is not a your morality checklist. Art is not supposed to provide you with an escapist fantasy or confirm your assumptions about what your worldview is. And it certainly does not exist to make you feel like a better person. Uh, this mindset is both demeaning to the artist who created the work and, ironically, you, the person engaging with it. And yet, increasingly, that's how people approach it, like as a binary sort of sorting mechanism of uh, progressive or problematic, you know? And this is a very shallow way to engage with art. And you are doing yourself a disservice by looking at art in this very one-dimensional way. When you treat art as a vehicle for your own sense of moral superiority, you're missing its capacity to provoke, to disturb, and even contradict itself, right? Good art oftentimes is contradictory. And so, looking at it through this primarily through this moral lens, leading off with your own moral rubric for what constitutes um, a sufficiently progressive movie, for example, uh, you're missing art's ability to engage you on a level that transcends these neat little ethical categories that you have contrived in your mind. And so one thing I do want to say right off the bat, like a caveat, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't approach art critically or ignore the political or historical forces that shape it, right? Like I am a strong advocate for criticism and in specifically um, in the school of sort of historicizing things, right? But when you lead off with your personal sense of ethics, this sort of like simplistic uh, algorithm ready type of virtue signaling, this is fundamentally misguided, and it assumes that morality exists in a vacuum apart from history and politics and apart from the systems that shape every aspect of our lives. And worse, it reduces art as a tool for reinforcing something you already believe, stifling its ability to challenge and potentially reconfigure your thinking. Um, and this mindset didn't emerge from nowhere, right? Its roots lie in a particular strain of American progressivism, for starters, that stretches back to the early 20th century. Um, and of course, the progressive movement achieved a lot, right? Like antitrust legislation, labor protections, public health reforms. but it was also marked by a sort of unsettling faith in moral certainty and technocratic management of society, right? Because at the same time, you get progressivism and Taylorism at the same time, right? Um, that is not that should not be considered a coincidence. Figures like Woodrow Wilson um, preached the gospel of progressive reform. You People like this were enamored with the idea of creating a rational, efficient society. And this came oftentimes at the expense of deeper systemic change that was actually needed. Progressivism became, in many ways, a project of tidying up society rather than actually interrogating the structures of power and ideology that led to these inequities in the first place. And then this ethos carries over into the cultural realm, right? So art for early progressives was a civilizing force, a tool for moral and social control. But in treating art as a very flat, one dimensional sort of means to an end, as a way to sort of inculcate proper values, progressives stripped art of its radical potential entirely. Um, and art that did not conform to their vision of progress was often dismissed, sidelined, or outright censored. And this paternalistic approach to culture lays the groundwork for the kind of binary thinking that we see today, where art is judged not on its complexity or its ability to engage with difficult truths, but on whether or not it aligns with contemporary moral sensibilities of a very small handful of incredibly online people on the internet. Um, and touching back on American progressivism, one example that can be found, like the Americanization campaigns of the early 20th century, were spearheaded by reformers who saw cultural assimilation as a key component of societal progress. And while they often frame their efforts as benevolent, um, these were attempts to uplift immigrant communities, right? The underlying project was deeply paternalistic and condescending. Uh, the aim essentially is to impose a specific vision of morality and culture on diverse populations. Art and culture were central tools in this campaign. Reformers used music, literature, and visual art as a means to sort of civilize immigrants and promote works that align with their vision of what it meant to be a good American. Um, so for example, institutions like settlement houses, led by figures such as Jane Addams, organized art programs and cultural events designed to instill bourgeois values in immigrant communities. Adams herself, well, like obviously she was genuine in her commitment to social reform. No one denies that. But it's nonetheless the case that she often saw art as a way to sort of smooth the rough edges of urban immigrant life and steer it towards a more orderly and harmonious existence. And do I need to even really explain to you why that's condescending and, borderline racist? Um, this approach this approach reflects a sort of utilitarian view of art. Um, Again, like it's a means to an end, a way to enforce a particular moral and social order. And what it lacks is any appreciation for art's capacity to potentially challenge or disrupt or critique the very systems that these progressives sought to manage. So you can understand why there's a conflict of interest there. Um, in their rush to uplift the masses, they strip art of its potential to serve as a space for radical questioning or dissent. We see this exemplified in the sentiments of Addams in a function of the social settlement. So specifically, I have here, she says, the chief characteristic of art lies in freeing the individual from a sense of separation and isolation from his emotional experience. Okay, that sounds nice, right? It is. This is a nice thought, right? But when taken as an imperative for how all art should function, as a sort of moral declaration, it's reductive. It frames art as a kind of balm for the alienated individual and as a way to neatly stitch them back into the social fabric so they can essentially so they can be functional within a dysfunctional system, right? And we see this sentiment echoed by later thinkers such as David Foster Wallace, who says that the function of literature is to make people feel less alone, right? Again, a very nice sentiment, isn't it? Um, but the, I mean, and this resonates with me to some degree, of course, but um, it ultimately falls into the same trap. You are reducing art to a sort of emotional utility as though its higher purpose is to like console people. And you know, think about this just for a second. What message does this actually send to young artists? Like some perhaps some of the greatest minds of their generation, like Gen Z, are being told that the function of art is to console people. You can see why that might limit their potential in certain ways. Don't tell them what their job is as artists. Let's start with that, for example. Um, while Adams and Wallace sideline the sort of disruptive, provocative potential of art, the ways um, it can sort of challenge our assumptions and force us to confront some truly disturbing contradictions about existence. Um, in focusing so narrowly on some nebulous sense of human connection or consolation, the risk here is you end up flattening the complexity of what art can really do. Art's power is not simply in making us feel better or less alone. It's in it's in forcing us to see the world and sometimes ourselves differently. And don't get me wrong, like this is often a painful process. Uh, and it does us no good to ignore that. And this same ethos appears in the censorship campaigns of the period as well. Progressive reformers frequently supported regulation of so-called immoral content in art and entertainment, um, from salacious novels to early Hollywood films. And Addams is on record herself as expressing a kind of dismissal of the dance halls of her time. So she's just kind of a killjoy. I'm sorry. um, it's a conservative impulse fundamentally, and they ignore how certain forms of art might reflect or critique the realities of the time, um, realities that their proposed reforms might fail to address, at a structural level. So the fixation on tidying up cultural expression mirrored their sort of broader tendency to manage the symptoms rather than actually critically interrogate the root causes. Um, so this historical context illustrates how early progressives approached art as a tool for moral and social engineering rather than a domain for challenging the status quo. It's a pattern that resonates with contemporary tendencies to view art through a sort of reductive moral framework, stripping it of the messy, contradictory, and often radical potential that makes it transformative. Um, and then, of course, there are like the right wing conservatives who later pushed the Satanic Panic and that narrative, right? If the early progressive reformists approach art as a tool for well, let's view it charitably from their position, moral uplift. Um, their right wing counterparts later wielded morality as a sort of weapon of suppression, fundamentally. And so the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 90s serves as a pretty stark example of this, where conservatives sought to demonize certain forms of art and entertainment as corrupting influences on society. And during the Satanic Panic, everything from like metal music and horror movies to Dungeons and Dragons became targets for these farcical moral crusades. These works were accused of promoting Satanism, violence, and moral decay, often with like no evidence at all beyond their provocative themes or um, aesthetics, right? And much like the progressive reformers of the early 20th century, conservatives viewed art not as a space for exploration or dissent, but essentially as a battleground for enforcing social conformity. So, are you noticing a pattern here? And what's really fascinating is how similar the underlying logic is. Both movements reduce art to its perceived moral impact while ignoring its broader cultural, historical, and aesthetic dimensions. So for conservatives, art was dangerous because it allegedly sort of undermined traditional values. And for progressives, art was valuable insofar as it could enforce societal progress. In both cases, art's capacity to question or provoke or unsettle, potentially, was treated as a threat to be managed or possibly eliminated. The Satanic Panic wasn't just like a cultural phenomenon either, it was deeply political. It emerged during the Reagan era, a time when conservative ideologues sought to reassert dominance in the face of the social changes of the 60s and 70s, right? So, by targeting art and entertainment, conservatives framed themselves as defenders of moral order against some encroaching chaos. And of course, this was deeply hypocritical. These same conservatives championed an economic system that breeds inequality and despair, um, conditions that are far more corrosive to society than any metal album or any sort of satanic themed T-shirt ever could be, right? But perhaps the most troubling aspect of both progressives and conservative approaches is how they converge in their ability to see art for what it truly is, their inability to see art for what it truly is, which is it's a reflection on the messy complexity of reality. That that in their heads there is no space for ambiguity. Um, so it would suffice to say that the Satanic Panic was a cartoonishly repressive movement in history. But it draws from the same well of moral absolutism that the early progressives tapped into when they sought to censor immoral content or promote only uplifting art. Both sort of reveal a discomfort with contradiction, and a desire to smooth out the jagged edges of experience into something more tidy and palatable. So it's almost kind of an obsessive thing. Um, and here's the kicker, both sides ultimately fail to suppress art's power. Heavy metal, horror, role-playing games, these things are all still around, and they're thriving actually, um, in part because these attempts to censor art only make these things more alluring. And similarly, the early progressives, their efforts to sanitize art, it couldn't prevent the emergence of radical artistic movements that challenged their vision of, a harmonious, orderly society. And so, what's the lesson here? Um, to me, the lesson is art's true power lies in its resistance to being neatly categorized, and its ability to provoke or unsettle, and attempts to reduce art to a moral tool. Um, these thing, these attempts inevitably fall flat because they misunderstand fundamentally what art is and how it functions. Um, so I got the progressives, I got the conservatives, right? Let's go after the Stalinists. Soviet realism is another glaring example of what happens when art becomes subordinate to sort of rigid moral or ideological framework. And so, obviously, under Stalin's regime, Soviet realism wasn't just like a preferred aesthetic, it was mandated. Um, Art that was expected to serve the state by sort of glorifying their conception of socialism. So that, celebrating the working class and promoting an idealized vision of some ostensibly communist lifestyle. Um, Anything that deviated from this narrowly defined purpose was dismissed as bourgeois decadence and oftentimes outright banned. On the surface, this might seem like the polar opposite of the sort of uplifting art promoted by early American progressives or um, the conservative censorship of the Satanic Panic. But if you look closer, you'll see that same conservative impulse. It's a sort of discomfort with ambiguity or contradiction, and an obsessive need to control art and relegate it to some ideological or ostensibly moral agenda. So in Soviet realism, art becomes propaganda, um, stripped of its ability to seriously question, critique, or reflect the complexities of real life. So consider the implications of this. Um, Soviet realism wasn't just about celebrating workers or peasants. It was about erasing anything that didn't fit the state's narrative of progress and harmony. So, dystopian themes, personal anguish, or even like the simple acknowledgement of human frailty were sometimes deemed counter revolutionary. And art was, again, reduced to a moral or ideological checkbox where its value was measured solely by its utility to the state. So, this it shouldn't be surprising that this led to an aesthetic stagnation. By prioritizing ideological clarity over artistic innovation, Soviet realism suppresses the very qualities that make art vital in the first place. Um, Again, its ability to explore contradictions and embrace the messiness of reality and to imagine alternative futures. Um, even the artists who thrived under Soviet realism often had to compromise their vision and produce works that felt hollow or overly idealized. And so the result was a cultural landscape that, for all its grandeur, often lacked the depth and complexity of truly sort of transformative art. What's particularly ironic is that this approach undermines the very ideology that it's supposed to serve. So, by enforcing such rigid boundaries on artistic expression, the Soviet regime alienated many of the artists and intellectuals that might have been their strongest allies. And instead of fostering a vibrant creative culture that could potentially inspire genuine revolutionary fervor, Soviet realism often comes across as a sort of hollow exercise in state mandated optimism. Um, and yet, of course, even in this repressive environment, you see the cracks in this foundation. So, dissonant artists like Tarkovsky managed to create works that subtly critique the system while ostensibly adhering to its rules. Tarkovsky's films, for example, are rich with ambiguity, spirituality, and existential questioning, qualities that stand in stark contrast to the sort of bombastic clarity of Soviet realism. And his works serve as a reminder that even the most repressive regimes cannot fully suppress art's capacity to transcend boundaries and challenge the status quo. Um, what ties Soviet realism, American progressivism, and the sort of conservative satanic panic together is their shared failure to embrace art's fundamental nature. Whether the ideological goal is to uplift, suppress, or indoctrinate, reducing art as a tool for moral or ideological purposes misses its deeper power. Art is at its best when it's free to explore the full spectrum of experience, including the contradictions and uncertainties. And it's not the function of art is not to serve as propaganda, whether for a political movement, a moral crusade, or a state ideology. The purpose of art is to reflect, challenge, and function in some kind of transformative way to the broader culture. Um, so Soviet realism, for all its bombast, proves the futility of trying to control art in this way. And like American progressivism and conservative moral panics, it sought to use art as a vehicle for its agenda. And like them, it failed to understand that art's power lies in its resistance to being neatly categorized. So, in the end, the more you try to force art into a moral or ideological box, the more it slips through your fingers. And maybe that is the point. Um, the irony, of course, is that this approach undermines the very ideals it claims to uphold. So when art becomes a tool for moral instruction, it ceases to function as art. It becomes propaganda, um, incapable of provoking the discomfort and introspection that art genuinely demands. And worse yet, it creates a sort of shallow performative morality, um, a sort of a set of like aestheticized ethical principles that, uh, I mean, this type of thinking crumbles under even the slightest scrutiny. Um, so if your sense of morality cannot survive encountering something messy and challenging, uh, what good is it exactly? Um, what's particularly troubling to me is how this shallow engagement reinforces the broader logic of consumer capitalism. So algorithmic culture thrives on binaries, um, and sort of like oppositional identities. So engaging with art as a series of moral transactions aligns perfectly with this framework because you can like something, you can dislike something else, you can give something 5 stars, you can give something else 0 stars, right? Um, this reduces art to something that is consumed and discarded once its value has been extracted. And it's the ultimate sort of commodification of culture where even your own outrage can be monetized. Just like my outrage is being monetized right now, you might actually get an ad right here. So I understand the irony. Um, and yet, it is nonetheless the case that um, good art oftentimes refuses to be fully commodified. I've seen the radical potential in the art form of the alternate reality game, for example, because despite the more obvious examples of ARGs um, being used in the context of like this or that marketing ploy, there do exist a litany of works that are entirely free and accessible to the public, given that you have access to the internet, of course, and B, hinge upon a sort of communal participation that shapes the experience. Um, so, yeah, good art persists in its sort of messiness and its contradictions and its refusal to be neatly categorized. That is what makes it powerful. Good art does not hand you the answers, it forces you to grapple with the questions. It reflects the contradictions of its particular place and time. But it can also open up possibilities that were previously unimaginable. So if you're approaching art with a mindset of ticking off a series of like moral boxes, you're not only misunderstanding art, you are misunderstanding yourself. And you're denying yourself the opportunity to potentially grow and to be changed by something that might challenge your worldview. Um, yeah, uh, art is not a lecture like this is. Um, it's not a sermon. It's a sort of reflective mirror. And sometimes that reflection isn't flattering. And that is the point. So stop expecting art to coddle you and start asking it to challenge you. And it's not to say, like, look, I am not, it is not my position that um, one should be forced to watch something that makes them very uncomfortable, right? That's not what I'm saying. Um, if you're not in the right mindset for whatever reason to engage with something that might potentially make you feel uncomfortable, that's totally understandable. And I'm not saying that the onus should be on you to watch things that are upsetting to you, right? But don't impose your own fragility onto the society at large, because that is a conservative impulse. So that's my rant for the day. I hope you enjoy this. Uh, um, obviously, I feel strongly about this, but let me know what you think in the comments. And um, you know, if you found any kind of value in this, again, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon. I have a lot of stuff that you can access for as little as $1 a month. Um, And patrons who donate $5 and up, I just uploaded uh, a track that will be featured in my next analysis video. So um, there are various perks at various tiers. So that's probably the it's probably a messy way to pitch it, but I did not prepare any ad copy here. So um, yeah, that's all I got for you. Signing off. Have a good one.